Amara, a bright and ambitious 19-year-old college student, lived what appeared to be an ideal life in the quiet town of Mia. She was the pride of her conservative family, a home shaped by strict values and rigid expectations. Her father, Mr. Okafor, was not just a parent, but a figure of reverence in the community, a respected leader known for his charitable deeds, and Amara had grown up under his protective shadow, believing he always had her best interest at heart. Her mother, on the other hand, was a quiet, unassuming woman who seemed content to live in her husband's shadow, silently conforming to his every decision. Amara's upbringing was sheltered almost suffocatingly, so while her peers explored friendships and social freedoms, she remained tethered to her father's strict rules. Mr. Ord justified his restrictions as acts of love and care, often warning her about the dangers of the world outside their home. "The world is not a kind place for a young girl like you," he would say, his stoned yet tinged with fatherly concern. Amara trusted him implicitly, believing his guidance stemmed from a place of genuine love. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family dynamic lacked an unsettling tension. Mr. Okafor's protective demeanor often crossed the line into control. He monitored Amara's phone calls, questioned her about her whereabouts, and discouraged her from forming close friendships. He dismissed her small acts of independence as rebellion, ensuring she remained reliant on him for both emotional and practical support. Amara, in her naivety, saw this as a sign of her father's devotion. She didn't recognize the subtle erosion of her personal bound. Her mother's passive role only deepened this dynamic. Mrs. Okafor rarely intervened in her husband's decisions, offering little comfort or advice to Amara. She seemed to float through the household like a ghost, always busy, but never present. Amara longed for her mother's guidance, but had learned not to expect it. Her father's word was final, and her mother's quiet compliance reinforced this higher. As Amara transitioned from adolescence to adulthood, the subtle cracks in her father's behavior began to show. His affectionate gestures, once reassuring, started to feel invasive. A lingering hand on her shoulder, a gaze that lasted a moment too long, or a question about her personal life that felt unnecessarily intimate. It was all too easy for Amara to dismiss these moments as harmless. She trusted her father blindly, convincing herself that these signs were figments of her imagination. But deep down, Anon began to grow like a shadow, creeping into her mind. The word she thought she knew, the man she trusted most, carried secrets that would soon shatter her reality. Amara had no idea that the foundation of her life, built on trust and familiar love, was about to crumble. The night that irrevocably changed Amara's life began like any other. Her family had just returned from a lively celebration at her uncle's house. Laughter, music, and the warmth of family togetherness had filled the air. However, as the evening drew to a close, her mother left to visit a sick relative in another town, leaving Amara alone with her father, Mr. Okafor. At first, the atmosphere at home seemed normal. Mr. Okafor appeared unusually cheerful as he set the table with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "You've made me proud, Amara," he said, his voice filled with pugnal pride. "You're no longer a child. It's time we celebrate your achievements like adults." Amara hesitated and used to search casual camaraderie from her father, but his warm demeanor and insistence convinced her to join him. The first sip of wine tasted strange, but she dismissed it as her lack of familiarity with alcohol. Her father filled her glass again, engaging her in conversation about her studies and future plans. The dialogue felt unusually personal, almost intimate. As he praised her beauty and intelligence, Amara felt a flicker of unease, but she told herself she was overthinking. After all, this was her father, a man she had trusted her entire life. As the evening progressed, Amara began to feel a heavy fog descending over her mind. Her thoughts grew sluggish, and her limbs felt impossibly heavy. She tried to excuse herself, mumbling something about being tired, but her voice was barely audible. Her father's face blurred as he stood up, and the room swirled around her before she could make sense of what was happening. Darkness consumed her. What happened next was a fragmented nightmare. Amara's senses alternated between numbing stillness and flashes of horrifying awareness. She felt the sensation of being carried, the weight of her body pressed into her bed, and the blood shadow of her father above her. Panic surged within her, but her body refused to move, trapped under an invisible force. Her mind screamed for clarity, but the fog cloud in her thoughts silenced her cry eyes when she woke the next morning. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, bathing the room in an ear and also her body in ways she couldn't explain. Her father was in the kitchen humming as he prepared breakfast. "Good morning, my darling," he said with a wide smile. When she entered the room, his tone was warm, affectionate, so ordinary that Amara almost believed nothing had happened, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. Fragments of the night returned in waves, each memory more haunting than the last. She felt an unsettling disconnection between her father's cheerful demeanor and the images replaying in her mind. Was it all a dream, a terrible, vivid hallucination? The question southwest in her head, and she couldn't bring herself to ask him directly. Over the next few days, Amara began noticing subtle changes in her father's behavior. He was unusually attentive, always asking about her well-being, offering small gifts, and keeping a close eye on her. What might have once seemed like concern now felt suffocating. Every time he entered the room, her chest tightened with unease. His gaze lingered a moment too long. His touch, once near, felt invasive. Amara's confusion spiraled into denial. She began convincing herself that she had imagined the whole thing. Surely her father, the man who had protected and provided for her all her life, couldn't have betrayed her in such an unimaginable way. She clung to the illusion of her father's integrity, even as her instincts screamed otherwise. But her body wouldn't let her forget. The soreness lingered, a physical reminder of the unspoken truth. Found herself recoiling from his touch, avoiding his presence whenever possible. Yet every time she considered voicing her suspicions, the thought of his rat silenced her. Mr. Okafor's presence was commanding his reputation on Abel. She doubted anyone would believe her in her isolation. Amara began to retreat inward, speaking less and withdrawing from the world around her. Her mother noticed her changed demeanor, but attributed it to typical teenage mood. Amara longed to confide in her mother, but her father's omnipresence and her mother's difference to him made it impossible. She felt trapped, suffocating under the weight of her growing fears and unanswered questions. The betrayal gnawed at her, eroding the foundation of trust she had once taken for granted. The man she had idealized, who had been her protector and guide, now stood at the center of her war. Fierce Amara didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning. The full weight of the truth was still waiting to crush her. Amara's life had taken on a strange rhythm of discomfort and unease. Weeks had passed since the night she tried desperately to forget, but her body refused to let her move on. Every morning, she was greeted with waves of nausea that left her doubled over, unable to stomach even the simplest meals. Her energy dwindled, and an unshakable fatigue clung to her. No matter how much rest she got, she told herself it was stress, the demands of her upcoming exams, or perhaps a mild illness. But deep down, the seed of doubt had already been planted. Her father, Mr. Okafo, seemed to notice her decline in health, though his concern only heightened her own. "As you've been looking pale lately," he observed one morning, his tone deceptively caring as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You should rest more. No need to push yourself so hard." His words, once comforting, now felt like a trap. The memories of that night haunted her like shadows she couldn't outrun, and his presence served as a constant reminder of the ones she was trying to suppress. Amara's mind raised with possibilities, but denial was her stronger just ally. Surely she thought it was all in her head. The thought of connecting her symptoms to something more sinister was too terrifying to entertain. But when her period failed to arrive, her fear grew louder, impossible to ignore. Each passing day felt like a countdown to a devastating truth she wasn't ready to face. It was during one particularly restless night that she decided to confide in her closest friend, Cha. Amara's voice trembled as she shared her symptoms and her growing fears. Choma, always the practical one, suggested they get a pregnancy test. "It's probably nothing," Choma said, trying to sound reassuring, even though her own was evident. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, they sneaked out to a nearby pharmacy. Amara's hands shook as she paid for the test, avoiding the cashier's gaze, as if her guilt were written all over her face. Back home, Amara locked herself in the bathroom. The silence of the house was deafening as she stared at the small stick in her hand, willing the result to confirm her denial. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and when the result finally appeared, her words shattered. The two unmistakable lines stared back at her, A cruel confirmation of her worst fears. She was pregnant, her breath cut, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Amara sank to the floor, clutching the test as tears streamed down her face. Memories of that night came rushing back in sharp, painful flashes, the fog in her mind, the weight pressing her down, and the blurry figure she could no longer deny was her father. The realization hit her with the force of a thunderbolt. Her father was the father of her child. The betrayal was too overwhelming to comprehend. Her mind raised with questions, accusations, and an unbearable sense of shame. How could this happen? How could the man she had trusted and loved more than anyone in the world betray her in such a devastating way? Amara's entire identity crumbled as she grappled with the horrifying truth. In the days that followed, Amara withdrew further into herself. Her father's presence became unbearable, his every gesture a reminder of what he had done, yet she couldn't bring herself to confront him. His control over the household was suffocating, and his reputation as a respected community leader made her feel powerless. Who would believe her if she spoke out? How could she explain the unimaginable without being dismissed as delusional? Desperate for support, Amara tried to confide in her mother. She chose her words carefully, hoping her mother would see the urgency in her trembling voice and terror-stricken face. But her mother's response was a crushing blow. "You're being dramatic, Amara," she said, waving her off dismissively. "Your father loves you. Don't say such things." The unshakable loyalty her mother had for her father left Amara feeling even more isolated. Her only lifeline was Cha. When Amara finally shared the full truth, her friend's reaction was one of shock and anger, not at Amara, but at the injustice of it all. "You can't stay there," Chase said firmly. "You need to get out." Together they began planning Amara's escape, knowing that staying in her father's house was no longer an option. For the first time in weeks, Amara felt a glimmer of hope, a faint, fragile light at the end of a very dark tunnel. Amara had been grappling with a horrifying truth for weeks, her mind constantly string with fear, confusion, and anger. Her once unshakable trust in her father had turned into a deep-seated dread, and the weight of her secret was suffocating. It was Cha's unweaving support that gave her the courage to confront the man who had shattered her word. "You have to confront him," Amara, Cha urged. "He needs to know you won't stay silent." That evening, as the house fell into its usual evening quiet, Amara stood in the living room, her hands trembling, but hers all firm. She waited for her father to finish his dinner, the sound of his cutlery clinking against the plate grating on her nerves. When he finally set his down and glanced at her with his usual commanding expression, she knew it was time. "Papa," she began, a voice trembling despite her best efforts. "We need to talk." Mr. Okafor raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "Of course, my dear, what's on your mind?" Amara swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know what you did," she said, her voice breaking. "That night, I know it was you." For a moment, silence filled the room, the air thick with tension. Mr. Okafor's expression hardened, his calm demeanor replaced with a steady glare. "What are you talking about, Amara?" he said, his tone sharp and defensive. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she shot back, finding strength in her anger. "You drugged me. You betrayed me in the worst way possible." Mr. Okafor stood up abruptly, towering over her, his face twisted into a mask of fury and disbelief. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile?" he said. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? You're trying to destroy your own father." Amara took a step back, her resolve wavering under the force of his denial. "I remember enough," she said, her voice shaking. "And I'm pregnant. It's your child. And you know it." At her words, his expression shifted from anger to something darker, panic mixed with calculation. "You're confused, Amara," he said, his tone suddenly soft and patronizing. "You're under a lot of stress. Your imagination is running wild. I would never do such a thing to my own daughter." But Amara saw through his act. The panic in his eyes betrayed him, and it fueled her determination. "Stop lying," she cried. "You know the truth, and I know it too. You can't manipulate me anymore." Realizing that his denials weren't working, Mr. Okafor's demeanor changed once again. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "No one will believe you," he said. "You're just a naive little girl with wild accusations. If you try to tell anyone, you'll only embarrass yourself and destroy this family." Amara froze, her breath catching in her throat. His words cut deep, feeding her insecurities and fear. But before she could retreat into silence, he continued, his voice dripping with feigned remorse. "I made a mistake. he said, his tone suddenly pleading. I'm only human, Amara. I was weak, but it was only because I love you so much. Can't you understand that? His chins into something almost noble, something forgivable. You don't love me, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You don't love anyone but yourself. Amara knew she couldn't stay another moment in that house. She had to leave for her safety and the safety of the child growing inside her that night. With Chaz's help, she began to plan her escape under the guise of spending the evening at Chaz's house to study. Amara packed a small bag. She included her essentials, a few changes of clothes, her school documents, and a pregnancy test that served as undeniable proof of her father's actions. As the house fell silent, Amara crept down the stairs, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboard. She paused at the front door, listening for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, but she knew her father's habit of staying up late, often sitting in his study. Her hand shook as she unlocked the door, the cool night air rushing in. As she stepped outside, the darkness enveloped her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of freedom. Como was waiting for her at the end of the street, her face etched with worry. Let's go, she whispered, taking Amara's bag and guiding her away from the house. As they walked through the empty streets, Amara felt a mix of fear and relief. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't go back. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope for justice, for healing, and for a life free from her father's control. This escape was only the beginning of her journey, but in that moment it felt like the first real step toward reclaiming her life. Amara sat in Chaz's small, cozy living room, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The weight of what she had endured still pressed heavily on her, but for the first time she felt a faint glimmer of safety. Choma had been her rock, offering her refuge and a listening ear when she had nowhere else to turn. Now it was time to take the next step. You can't stay silent about this, Amara, Como said, firmly, sitting beside her. What he did is unforgivable, and he needs to face the consequences. Amara nodded, though her heart raised at the thought of confronting her father through the legal system. What if no one believes me, she whispered. He's so respected. People will think I'm lying. That's why we need help, Cha replied, determination shining in her eyes. There are organizations that deal with cases like this. They'll know what to do. The next morning, Cha accompanied Amara to a local women's support organization. The small office was filled with posters about domestic violence, legal rights, and hotlines for victims. Amara was greeted by a counselor named Mrs. Ad, a compassionate woman with a calm demeanor that immediately put her at his. For the first time, Amara shared her full story, every detail of her father's betrayal and the pregnancy she now carried. Tears flowed freely as she recounted the events, but the act of speaking her truth brought an unexpected sense of relief. You are incredibly brave, Amara, Mrs. Ad said softly. What happened to you is not your fault, and you deserve justice. We'll help you every step of the way. The organization connected Amara with a legal advocate and a trauma counselor. The counselor sessions became a lifeline for her, helping her process her pain and build the confidence she needed to move forward. Through therapy, Amara began to shed the shame and self-doubt that had haunted her. The advocate, meanwhile, explained the legal options available to her, out the steps to file charges against her father. Amara knew the road ahead would be long and grueling, but she was determined to fight with the organization's support. She officially pressed charges against Mr. Okafo. The process of filing the case felt like an act of defiance, a reclaiming of her power after months of silence and fear. The legal battle that followed tested every ounce of Amara's strength. Her father, at the accusations, used his considerable influence to try and discredit her. He painted her as an ungrateful daughter who had fabricated a story to tarnish his reputation. His lawyers called her character into question, bringing up her sheltered upbringing as evidence of her unstable imagination. Amara's resolve wavered under the relentless scrutiny, but the women's organization stood firmly by her side. They helped her prepare for court, providing emotional and legal support. You're not alone, Choma reminded her before every hearing. We all here for you. The backlash from the community was sharp and divisive. Some neighbors rallied around Amara, praising her courage for standing up to such an influential figure. Others, however, accused her of lying, questioning why she hadn't spoken up sooner. The whispers and judgment weighed heavily on her, But she refused to let them deter her from seeking justice. As the trial progressed, cracks began to appear in Mr. Okafor. Inconsistencies in his statements and testimonies from other family members painted a damning picture. The community that had once revealed him now began to see the truth. Amara sat quietly in the courtroom. As the verdict was announced, her hands trembled slightly, clasped tightly together on her lap. She had spent weeks relieving the trauma, facing the relentless scrutiny of the legal system, and her community. Her father had tried every tactic to paint her as a liar, as an unstable young woman, seeking attention. Yet yes, she was at the CP of justice. When the words guilty left the judge's lips, at which she hadn't even realized she was carrying, lifted from her shoulders, tears welled in her eyes as a wave of relief washed over her. Her father was sentenced to a lengthy prison time for his crimes, and for the first time in months, Amara felt safe. It was not just a victory for her, but for every woman who had suffered in silence, every victim who had been dismissed and disbelieved. She had stood up against the man who had once loomed larger than life, and she had won. It was a moment of justice, not only for herself, but for the child growing within her, who would now never have to grow up in the shadow of such darkness. The victory, however, was bittersweet. Amara knew that justice could not erase the pain, nor could it give her back the life she once had. The road ahead would be long, and she would have to rebuild from the ground up. But for the first time, she felt like she had the strength to do so. Her journey from victim to survivor was far from over, but she was determined to embrace the future with courage and hope. Amara made the decision to keep the baby, not as a reminder of her trauma, but as a testament to her resilience. The child growing within her was not just a symbol of what she had endured, but of her strength to rise above it. She vowed to raise her child with the love and protection she had been denied, ensuring they would never have to face the horrors she had lived through. This decision, though difficult, became the cornerstone of her new beginning. With the help of the Women's Support Organization and her trusted friend Amara moved to a new city. It was a fresh start, a place where she could live behind the whispers and judgment of her old community and focus on healing. She enrolled in therapy, diving deep into the work of reclaiming her sense of self. Slowly but surely, the pieces of her shattered identity began to come together again. In this new chapter of her life, Amara discovered the purpose she hadn't anticipated. She began volunteering with the same organization that had helped her through her darkest days. Her story became a source of inspiration for other survivors, a reminder that justice was possible and that their voices mattered. Amara's passion for advocacy grew, and soon she found herself speaking at events and workshops, sharing her journey to empower others. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now carried the weight of experience and the power of hope. One day, standing before a room filled with survivors and advocates, Amara shared the words that had carried her through her darkest moments. "Our pain doesn't define us," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Our courage does. What we endure doesn't make us weak. It makes us stronger than we ever imagined. And together, we can create a world where no one has to suffer in silence." The room erupted into applause, but Amara didn't need the recognition for her. This was about more than her personal victory. It was about creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to find their strength and fight for justice. Her journey had been painful and brutal, but it had also given her a purpose she could never have imagined. Amara's life was far from perfect, but it was hers. She had taken back her power, built a future for herself and her child, and become a beacon of hope for others. The scars of her past remained, but they no longer defined her. They were reminders of her resilience, proof that she had survived and thrived despite everything. In the end, Amara's story was not just one of survival, but of transformation. She had turned her pain into power, her silence into a voice that could no longer be ignored. And as she looked toward the future, she knew that she was not alone. She was part of a movement, a community of survivors who would continue to fight for a world where justice and compassion prevailed. Amara had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her hope, and in doing so, she had lit art for others us to follow. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe our African F Tales channel.